Think about those interstate highway numbers for a second. Odd goes north-south, even goes east-west. Seems pretty simple, right?
Yeah, on the surface. But that simplicity, it hides this really fascinating story about how America, connected itself.
And get this, the initial plan, back in '44, only authorized up to 40,000 miles. We've been digging through a whole stack of stuff, old reports, government sites, history papers.
Right. And today we're doing a deep dive into the method and the whole history behind the U.S. Interstate Highway System.
Exactly. Our mission, if you will, is to sort of unpack that numbering system that feels intuitive but have layers, and then explore the incredible story of how this massive, massive project actually happened.
Yeah, it's a story that says a lot about American planning, definitely about politics, and just the sheer scale of progress back then. Hopefully you'll start seeing those highway signs a little differently.
You really will. The idea is to get a much deeper feel for the roads you probably drive on all the time, maybe uncover some surprising bits about how they were designed, how they changed.
And just appreciate the size of it all. It was huge.
Okay, so let's start with making sense of that numbering system. Where should we begin?
Let's do it. The core, like you said, is those primary interstates, the 1- and 2-digit ones, that basic grid.
The odd and even thing.
Exactly. Odd numbers run generally north to south, and the numbers get bigger as you go from west to east.
Okay, so like I-5 on the Pacific coast.
Perfect example. Then jump all the way across the country. You've got I-95 on the Atlantic coast.
Right. That alone must have revolutionized things compared to the old roads.
Oh, absolutely. Standardized travel, commerce, everything.
And the east-west roads. Same idea, just flipped.
Yep. Even numbers, and they increase as you head north from the south.
So I-10 across the southern states.
And I-90 way up north near the Canadian border in parts. It's elegant in its simplicity, really. A national map based on logic.
Yeah, it is.
And another key thing, those numbers ending in 0 or 5, they weren't random.
Ah, what's the significance there?
Those were deliberately chosen for the major long-haul routes, the real arteries, connecting vast parts of the country.
Like the I-10, I-90, I-5, I-95 you just mentioned, the backbone roads.
Precisely. They form the main structure.
Now, you mentioned a rule earlier about not duplicating existing U.S. highway numbers in the same state. That sounds tricky.
It was, and it's a crucial rule. It directly explains some of the gaps you see in the interstate numbers.
Like which ones?
Well, the most obvious ones are I-50 and I-60. They just don't exist.
Why not?
Because planners deliberately skipped them to avoid confusion with US 50 and US 60, which were major established routes running through many of the same areas.
Ah, okay. Imagine the signs take I-50 versus take US 50. Yeah, that could get messy fast.
Total nightmare potential. They wanted clarity.
Makes sense. What about those letter suffixes? I've seen I-35W and I-35E in places. What's that about?
That was an earlier approach, used when a main interstate split, maybe to serve different sides of a big city like Minneapolis-St. Paul or Dallas-Fort Worth.
But you don't see them everywhere.
No. By 1973, AHH2, that's the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, they put out a policy discouraging them. Too confusing for drivers.
So they tried to phase them out.
Mostly, yeah. Through renumbering and redesignations over the years. But, like you said, a few exceptions hung on. Texas and Minnesota still have those I-35 splits.
Okay, so clarity was usually the goal. Now, moving on to the 3-digit interstates. The auxiliary routes, they feel much more local, right? City-focused.
That's exactly their purpose.
Yeah.
They serve specific metro areas. They function either as loops, kind of like beltways around a city, or as spurs that branch off the main interstate into the city.
And the numbering itself tells you which is which. There's a code.
There is. It's actually pretty neat. Look at the first digit.
Yeah.
If that first digit is even, say, I-495 around Washington, D.C., that usually means it's a loop or a beltway.
A loop, meaning it eventually reconnects with the main highway it came from.
Generally, yes. It forms a circle or partial circle, connecting back to its parent route. In the D.C. example, I-495 connects back to I-95 at both ends of the loop.
Got it. Even means loop or beltway. So odd must mean.
Odd first digit usually means a spur. Think of it like a branch off the main trunk.
A spur.
Yeah.
Leading into the city center or some other specific point.
Exactly. Like I-395, also in D.C., it branches off from I-95 and the I-495 beltway and heads right towards downtown Washington. Doesn't necessarily loop back.
Okay, that's a really helpful distinction. Even for loops, odd for spurs. And the last two digits, they must connect back to the main route somehow.
They do. That's the rule. The last two digits are supposed to match its parent primary interstate.
So an I-310 would be related to I-10.
That's the idea. Connects the local auxiliary route back to the major interstate it serves. Helps with orientation.
Makes sense. Now, I think I read somewhere that planners tried not to repeat those last two digits within the same state, even if they came off the same main interstate.
Yes, that's generally true. Within a single state, they try to use different hundreds digits if multiple auxiliaries branch off the same primary route.
To avoid confusion.
Right. So off I-80 in one state, you might see an I-280, and I-480, those are even, so likely loops, and maybe an I-180 or I-380 odd, so likely spurs.
Yeah.
Different first digits keep them distinct.
Keeps things organized locally. But that rule doesn't apply across state lines, does it?
No, it doesn't. You can definitely find an I-280 off I-80 in Ohio and another I-280 off I-80 in, say, California or Iowa. The no repeat rule for the hundreds digit is mainly an intrastate planning guideline.
Okay, so quick recap on numbers. 1 or 2 digits, big regional connectors.
What?
3 digits,
Yeah.
local metro area focus.
Right.
And that first digit of the 3 tells you, even for a loop beltway, odd for a spur into town.
You got it. It's quite a bit of information encoded in those numbers when you know the system. Pretty logical, considering the scale.
It really is.
Okay.
Okay, so we've got the blueprint, the numbering logic, but how did this whole thing actually get built? It wasn't overnight, right? This is decades in the making.
Oh, absolutely not overnight. Decades is right. The seeds were planted way back in the 1930s and 40s. There was this growing idea, this need for a national system of high-speed expressways.
What was driving that early thinking?
A couple of things. Military logistics were a big one, moving troops and supplies efficiently, but also economics. The potential boost to commerce and industry was huge.
Any specific plans back then?
Yeah, there was a key report in 1938 from the Bureau of Public Roads BPR called Toll Roads and Free Roads. It actually proposed a 26,700-mile interregional network.
And then World War II happened. That must have amplified the military need.
Definitely. President Roosevelt was very focused on this. During the war, he set up the National Interregional Highway Committee. Thomas MacDonald headed it up.
And they produced a report?
They did, in 1944, called Interregional Highways. It laid out a more detailed plan, about 34,000 miles plus another 5,000 for urban connections.
So vision was getting clearer. Did legislation follow?
Yes, a landmark step came with the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1944. It formally authorized the national system of interstate highways, up to 40,000 miles, connecting major cities, defense sites, even routes to Canada and Mexico.
40,000 miles. That sounds like the real beginning.
It was a huge authorization, but there was a catch.
Funding.
Exactly. The 1944 Act authorized the system, but it didn't provide any dedicated money to build it, so it was still mostly a concept on paper.
So when did the actual routes start getting mapped out?
That started happening after the war. In August 1947, the BPR and the states, working with the Defense Department, picked out the first tentative 37,700 miles of routes.
But these weren't the final numbered highways yet?
No, not at all. Think of them as broad corridors, general paths showing where the highways should go, connecting key points. The specific alignments and numbers came later.
Okay, so the idea was there, the general corridors were sketched out, but the money was missing. Then we hit the 1950s. Things started moving faster then, right? Especially with Eisenhower.
Absolutely. The 50s were pivotal. You had some initial small funding in the 52 Highway Act. But President Eisenhower, he really pushed hard for a massive highway program.
His military background played a role, didn't it? See, in the German Autobahn.
Immensely. He saw the strategic and economic value firsthand. He championed the cause. There was debate on how to pay for it. A bond plan was proposed in 55 by the Clay Committee.
But the big one was the 1956 Act.
That's the one. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, signed June 29th. That was the game changer.
What did it do specifically?
Several crucial things. It authorized an expanded system, 41,000 miles initially, later bumped up a bit.
And the money.
Critically, it established the Highway Trust Fund, funded by federal taxes on fuel and tires. This meant dedicated, reliable funding. The federal government would cover 90% of the cost.
90%? That's huge. No wonder things took off.
Exactly. It also officially named it the National System of Interstate and Defense Highways, really emphasizing that defense aspect Eisenhower valued.
And it mandated standards, right, to make sure the roads were consistent everywhere.
Yes. Uniform geometric design standards, developed by H.H. Cho and the BPR. Things like full control of access, no stoplights, no cross-traffic minimum of 4 lanes, Specific widths, design speeds between 50 and 70 mile per hour.
So a true national standard for high-speed travel.
That was the goal. And even before the 56 Act passed, there was this 1955 publication called the Yellow Book. It showed the general locations, including plans for many of the urban expressways.
So the planning was well underway. And then dirt started moving pretty quickly after the act passed.
Amazingly fast. Missouri awarded contracts in August 56 for upgrading part of Route 66 to what would become I-44. Kansas started paving I-70 in September 56. And Kansas actually completed a segment in 1957, often cited as the very first project finished under the 56 Act.
Incredible momentum. You mentioned the Pennsylvania Turnpike earlier as a kind of precursor.
Yeah, it opened way back in 1940. It really was the grandfather of the interstate system because its design limited access, high speed predated the 56 standards, but showed what was possible.
So funding secured, standards set, construction starting. What about the actual numbers and the signs we see today? When did those appear?
That happened pretty quickly, too. September 1957, ASHO and the BPR officially assigned the route number.
Using that odd-Jevon grid system we talked about.
Exactly. Odd for north-south, even for east-west, mirroring the U.S. highway system but avoiding those direct number conflicts within a state.
And the shield, the red, white, and blue sign.
Unveiled at the same time. Apparently, the design was influenced by proposals from Missouri and Texas. It became instantly recognizable.
That's a cool piece of trivia.
And things were moving on the ground, too. By June 57, just a year after the act, about 80% of the original mileage already had approved locations.
So the routes were firming up. What about the three-digit numbers for cities?
ASH finalized the system for those urban loops and spurs the three-digit interstates in 1958.
So within just 2 years of the 1956 Act, all the key pieces were basically in place. The money, the design rules, the numbering, ready for the big build-out.
Precisely. The stage was set for the 1960s, which became the decade of really intense, full-scale construction across the country.
The 60s must have been buzzing with activity then. Highways going up everywhere, rural and urban.
Absolutely. Construction crews were working nationwide, and the system even got a bit bigger. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1968 added another 1,500 miles, pushing the total towards 42,500, mostly for new routes or links within cities.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing, especially in cities, right? You hear about the freeway revolts.
That's very true. Building massive highways through established urban neighborhoods often met with really strong local resistance. People didn't want their communities divided or destroyed.
Did that resistance actually change things?
It did. It led to the introduction of formal environmental impact reviews and requirements for more public involvement in the highway planning process. It wasn't just about engineering anymore. Social impacts became a major factor.
So, progress, but with growing pains and adjustments. Meanwhile, those big long-distance routes were taking shape.
Yes, significant progress was made on routes like I-80, I-10, I-95. Many long stretches opened during the 60s, really starting to connect the country in a new way.
Then into the 70s. Was the end in sight by then?
The focus definitely shifted towards completion, towards closing the remaining gaps. Nebraska actually became the first state to finish all of its mainline interstates in 1974, the final piece of I-80 there.
That's a cool milestone for Nebraska.
It was. Also, in the 70s, AIH2 pushed that policy against the letter suffixes, remember, I-35WE. That led to some renumberings, like old I-80N in the Northwest becoming I-84.
Cleaning up the system. And another big one finished in 79.
Right. The last section of I-5 in California opened, creating a continuous freeway all the way from the Mexican border to the Canadian border, a huge achievement.
But those urban battles continue to have effects. Some routes just never got built as planned.
Absolutely. The opposition was successful in stopping or significantly altering major urban segments. I-95 through Washington, D.C. and parts of Boston are famous examples. Those cancellations forced major reroutings and adjustments to the whole network plan.
Which brings us to the 80s and 90s. This feels like the era where those coast-to-coast dreams finally became reality.
It really was the culmination. August 22, 1986, a big day. The final piece of I-80 opened, west of Salt Lake City. That made it the first truly transcontinental interstate freeway connecting the New York City area all the way to San Francisco.
Wow, coast to coast on one numbered road. Then I-10.
1990. The last gap in I-10 was closed by the Papago Freeway Tunnel in Phoenix. That completed the route from Los Angeles to Jacksonville.
And I-90.
1991. The final section opened, which was a viaduct through Wallace, Idaho, that connected Seattle to Boston and famously eliminated the very last traffic light on a mainline rural interstate.
The last stoplight. That feels symbolic.
It really did. And then the moment often cited as the completion of the originally planned system.
Glenwood Canyon.
Exactly. October 1992. The final miles of I-70 through Glenwood Canyon, Colorado were opened. An amazing engineering feat, and the symbolic end of the initial construction phase.
What was the final tally, roughly? Cost and mileage.
The initial system cost about $114 billion back then, which is something like $600 billion in today's money. And the network was around 45,000 miles by then.
Staggering investment. And it got Eisenhower's name officially attached too, right?
Yes, in 1990, Congress officially designated it the Dwight D. Eisenhower System of Interstate and Defense Highways, a fitting tribute.
But completion wasn't really the end, was it? The system kept growing.
Not at all. It's always been dynamic. Congress and H. have continued to approve additions and extensions since the 90s.
Like what kind of projects?
Things like the expansion of I-49 in Arkansas and Louisiana, developing the I-69 corridor through several states, extending routes like I-72 and I-74, adding totally new routes like I-22 in Alabama, Mississippi, or I-86 in New York, Pennsylvania.
So some were planned long ago, others are newer additions.
A mix, yeah. Some filled out earlier concepts, others addressed more recent needs. By 2022, the system had grown to almost 49,000 miles.
And even recently, that notorious gap in I-95 got fixed.
Finally, yes, in 2018, the interchange connecting I-95 and the Pennsylvania Turnpike near the New Jersey border opened, making I-95 truly continuous from Florida to Maine. A decades-long headache resolved.
So it's still evolving, still a living network. Now let's talk about some of those weird quirks and exceptions. Integrating old toll roads sounds like it caused some headaches.
It definitely created some unique situations. The decision back in '56 to incorporate existing toll roads like Pennsylvania Turnpike, the New York Thruway, Ohio Turnpike, etc., was pragmatic in some ways.
How so?
Well, it avoided the cost of building a brand new free road right next to a perfectly good toll road, and it helped states get compensated for roads they'd already built. But
It meant tolls on the interstates.
exactly. About 2,900 miles of the system are tolled today under those grandfathered exceptions, and it led to numbering weirdness.
Like the I-95 issue you just mentioned.
That's a prime example. Parts of the New Jersey Turnpike were designated I-95, but then the planned free section of I-95 nearby got canceled due to opposition. This created that infamous gap where I-95 just stopped and drivers had to navigate local roads or other routes to pick it up again. Took decades to fix.
So compromises made early on had long-lasting effects. What about I-238? That number just seems wrong based on the rules.
Chuckles. Yeah, I-238 in the San Francisco Bay Area is a real outlier. It violates the three-digit rule because there's no parent I-30.
Yeah, so why does it exist?
It boils down to California's very strict rule about not having duplicate highway numbers within the state.
Yeah.
The road itself connects I-580 and I-880. It used to be State Route 238.
Yeah, right.
When it was upgraded to interstate standards, all the logical three-digit numbers ending in 80, like 180, 280, 380, etc., were already assigned to other routes in California.
So they were boxed in.
Completely. Renumbering the whole corridor would have caused even more confusion and conflicts. So Caltrans basically requested to keep the existing number, 238, and just add the I prefix.
And Act 2 approved it.
They did. It's a case where state-level numbering constraints and the desire to avoid local confusion basically overrode the national standard. A unique outcome.
Fascinating. It shows how rules can bend under specific pressures. Then there are cases where Congress steps in, like I-99.
Yes, that's another category of exception. Legislative designation. Normally, Echtiyouhos handles interstate numbering based on the established plan and grid. But sometimes Congress includes specific route numbers in legislation.
And I-99 in Pennsylvania is one of those.
It's the classic example, designated by Congress in the 1995 National Highway System Act, largely due to the efforts of a powerful local congressman, Bud Schuster.
But the number itself doesn't fit the grid.
Not at all. It runs north-south in central Pennsylvania between I-76 and I-80, but its number 99 should place it way over on the East Coast if it followed the west-to-east increasing rule for odd numbers. It's west of I-95, even west of I-81 and I-79.
So it completely breaks the pattern.
Completely. Planners weren't thrilled, but it was written into law. It shows how political influence can directly shape the infrastructure right down to the number on the sign. I-97 in Maryland is a somewhat similar case, a two-digit number east of I-95.
Do you think these kinds of politically driven exceptions ultimately undermine the system's logic for drivers?
That's a really good question. You could argue both ways. On one hand, the system needs some flexibility to accommodate local needs or political realities. On the other, yeah, too many exceptions could definitely dilute that intuitive logic the grid provides. It's a balance.
Hmm. And we talked about urban routes being canceled. That must have led to renumberings, too.
For sure. When big chunks of planned interstates were scrapped, like I-95 in D.C. or I-695 in Boston, the remaining sections, sometimes just short stubs or spurs, often had to be renumbered.
Like in D.C.
Yeah, parts of the original I-95 alignment ended up becoming I-395 and I-295. And sometimes even loop routes didn't fully get completed as loops due to changes, but they kept their number.
Like I-275 around Cincinnati.
That's one example. Or I-295 around Providence. They function more like partial beltways now, but retain the loop designation, probably for continuity. There was also that I-70, I-76 swap in Pennsylvania involving the turnpike numbering can get complex when routes change.
It definitely requires keeping track. And finally, the system technically includes places off the mainland: Alaska, Hawaii, Puerto Rico.
That's right. For funding and administrative purposes, they are part of the federal Interstate Highway System, even though they obviously don't connect to the continental network.
How are they numbered?
They use special designations. Hawaii uses an H prefix, like H1, H2, H3. They're signed that way locally.
Okay.
Puerto Rico has highways built to interstate standards, like PR-52 or PR-22, but they aren't typically signed as interstates. In federal logs, you might see them designated PRI-1, PRI-2, etc.
In Alaska.
Alaska has routes designated with an A prefix on paper, A1, A2, etc., but again, you won't see interstate shields on the roads themselves.
So they're part of the system legally and for funding, but numbered differently to show they aren't connected to the main grid.
Exactly. It reflects their unique status while still including them under the interstate umbrella.
Wow. So from that seemingly simple odd-even grid
To toll road integrations, legislative overrides like I-99, the whole I-238 anomaly, renumberings from freeway revolt, and even routes in Hawaii.
the story of the interstate highway system is definitely way more complex and honestly more interesting than just the numbers on the signs suggest.
It truly is. It's this blend of, grand vision, decades of hard work, technical planning, political maneuvering, and reaction to community needs. It all shaped what we drive on today.
After digging into all this, you really do start looking at those interstate signs differently. Knowing the logic, the history, the exceptions, it adds a whole other layer to just driving down the road.
It really does. It gives you an appreciation for the massive scale of the project, the foresight involved, but also the controversies and compromises along the way. It fundamentally reshaped America.
So the next time you're cruising down an interstate, maybe take a second look at that sign. Think about the grid, odd or even, high number or low. Think about the history embedded in that simple shield.
Yeah. And it makes you wonder, what's the next chapter for this system? It's aging, facing new challenges, maintenance, funding, climate change, maybe even autonomous vehicles.
That's a great point. What does the future hold for the Dwight D. Eisenhower system of interstate and defense highways in the 21st century and beyond? Definitely something to think about on your next road trip.